You're listening to the fourth module of the International Security course. In this module, we will continue our discussion of terrorism. I'm skipping over some of the book content with regards to nationalist terrorism as it pertains to the Irish Republican Army and other nationalist groups, but be sure to read that material in the Townsend book. In this particular module, audio lecture, I'm going straight into the Islamic terrorism, beginning with a look at Islamic nationalist terrorists, those terrorists who are trying to realize some kind of nationalist goal, specifically the liberation of Palestine in opposition to Israel. And after that, I'll go into the more broader Islamic terrorism that we're more familiar with today, that deals with groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their other surrogates. So I want to begin with Hezbollah and Hamas. All terrorism, as we've already kind of discussed, is political in its orientation. But these two are particularly oriented towards political goals in that they're trying to liberate Palestine from what they see as Israeli occupation and oppression, ostensibly by destroying Israel itself and reestablishing a Palestinian homeland in its place. So we'll look at Hezbollah first. Hezbollah in Arabic translates to roughly the party of God. They are similar to the Irish Republican Army or the Basque separatists in that they are a political organization, or that their primary existence is a standalone political organization that has a militant wing that is deployed when it's necessary to engage in what they deem as appropriate violent action against Israel, Israeli targets, or Lebanese targets. Hezbollah is located in Lebanon, is active in Lebanese politics. There are Hezbollah representatives in the Lebanese parliament, and it has a foot in sort of both sides of the Palestinian liberation struggle. There is a political element to it, as I've already mentioned, and there's a militant, what we would call terrorist element to it as well, that uses assassinations, bombings, and other signature acts of terrorism to realize the political goal. It is not a purely religious group. It uses the imagery and rhetoric of Islam, but this group should not be confused with an Al-Qaeda or an ISIS. Indeed, their goals are very localized and very much limited to the Palestinian question. Within Israel itself, or at least within areas that are adjacent to Israel or formerly ruled by Israel, you have Hamas. This is a group that is actively seeking the liberation of Palestine at the expense of Israel. And like Hezbollah, it has a political component, but it's much less developed. Most of what Hamas is dedicated to is attacking Israeli targets, both in terms of attacking military targets and engaging activities against the broader Israeli population as a way of attempting to delegitimize the Israeli government. Currently, Hamas is the ruling faction, if you will, in the Gaza Strip. Several years ago, Israel, which used to rule the Gaza Strip, pulled out of that territory, that small territory, and basically left a political vacuum. Hamas stepped in and took over some of the day-to-day operations, but of course they're not a fully fledged government, a fully fledged ruling. Don't have a fully fledged ruling capability. So much of that area right now is densely populated and is a site of a lot of human suffering, both in terms of the mismanagement by Hamas and by the precipitous actions that Israel takes, largely to root out Hamas. One of the problems here is that Hamas has a tendency to fire unguided rockets, which you can sort of see pictured here in the slide, into Israeli population centers at Israeli cities. Most of the time, these rockets fall harmlessly. in open areas, but occasionally they'll strike a house or a densely populated part of the city, Israeli city, and will cause casualties. And because, you can't have rockets raining down on your people in your cities, Israeli takes steps to confront and destroy these rockets and those who are firing them. And in 2014, there was a particularly nasty invasion of the Gaza Strip by Israel to root out these Hamas rockets that resulted in thousands of casualties, both killed and wounded among the Palestinian civilians, and generally extended the stalemate that exists in Israel right now with regards to the Palestinian question. We don't have the time to go into the details of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, but this examples here show why that conflict is intractable right now. I want to move on to a more broader understanding of terrorism that's inspired by Islamism and Salafism, as we'll talk about here in a moment. This is the type of terrorism that we are most familiar with in recent memory, beginning with 9/11 and even a few events before 9/11, up to the present day. And if you want to sort of identify a starting point for this form of terrorism, you have to go back to the 1950s and an Egyptian by the name of Saeed Qutb, who's a very interesting fella. He actually went to school in Colorado. He went to graduate school as an exchange student at the University of Northern Colorado. And for whatever reason, when he was in Greeley, he found the place a cesspool of scum and villainy and decay and degeneracy and just didn't like the place very much, and returned to Egypt vowing to change Islam and change the states that where Islam was dominant in the Middle East in a way that would allow them to resist what he saw as this decadent American culture. So yeah, as I suggested, he comes back home from his time abroad. He finds the materialism of the West decadent and believes the only antidote to this spreading decadence is to have Muslim countries ruled under a strict interpretation of Islam. If you didn't do this, then the spreading cultural decadence would eventually turn the Middle Eastern countries into the same, what he saw as a cesspool, a cultural cesspool. The Islamic world would be transformed into the same cesspool as the West had become. And here in Qutb's beliefs and ideology, we see the origins and the roots, the activist roots of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Although it must be pointed out that they go much further than even Qutb himself said one ought to go. Qutb was about reforming and transforming Muslim states, in the Middle East. It was never about trying to conquer the world, which is sort of, as we'll see, where Al-Qaeda and ISIS come in. The terrorist groups of today we can probably best describe as Salafist. Salafism is a particularly conservative and very strict interpretation of Islamic teaching. Islam, like many other religions that have large followings, is broken up into different sects and different interpretations of the founding documents. And Salafism is a particularly conservative and a particularly radical interpretation of Islamic teaching. They take certain liberties and make certain conclusions based on the writings of Muhammad and his immediate followers that many Islamic scholars disagree with and say that are incorrect. Nevertheless, they have a substantial following around the world, including ruling governments in places like Saudi Arabia, where what's called Sharia law is practiced, is implemented into the legal codes. And as a result, there's some very strict interpretations and punishments for violations of the law in places like Saudi Arabia. The ultimate goal for a Salafist is to conquer the world through Islamic ideology, or in the language of the Salafists, to restore the Islamic Caliphate, which is a reference back to the Middle Ages when Islam and Islamic empires ruled the greater Middle East, including North Africa and at one point parts of Europe in Spain, Portugal, and on up into southwestern France. And the goal for a Salafist is to reconquer all that territory and ostensibly perhaps even expand that conquest, that earlier conquest. So these terrorist groups of today are best described as Salafist terror groups, and they include all the people we're familiar with, all the groups we're most familiar with for the last 20 years. Al-Qaeda, the various affiliates of Al-Qaeda, ISIS or ISIL, also called Daesh, and the various affiliates of that group as well. So let's begin with the group we're probably most familiar with, that's Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda means roughly the base in English, and this is a reference to the base of operations that existed in northern Pakistan, while Mujahideen freedom fighters fought against the occupation of Afghanistan by the Soviets during the 1980s. That many Muslim fighters, largely Arabic fighters, would travel to northern Pakistan, would sort of check in with the local heads of the resistance cells, and then would be given assignments in Afghanistan that they would go and fulfill with their fellow freedom fighters. This group persisted after the Soviet Union was ejected or withdrew out of Afghanistan, and these became the foundation blocks upon which a terror group or an organization was founded that launched many of the attacks against the West, against the United States in the late 1990s and then into 9/11 itself. The objection among these various Mujahideen fighters was that when the United States occupied Saudi Arabia in an attempt to push out Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, that they saw this as an invasion of the Muslim Holy Lands, Saudi Arabia being the place, the state where Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities in Islam, are located. So the fact that there were U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, the place where the state that hosts these holy cities, was seen as an invasion by the West. And so that sort of stirred the outrage of many Salafist followers of Sayyid Qutb and Osama bin Laden, and so that led to the attacks against the West. Originally, they followed the Qutb model, or the Qutb strategy of focusing on stirring Islamic revolution in Middle Eastern states, primarily states like Egypt, Algeria, and Saudi Arabia. But these were all largely failures, that the states proved to be, at least their governments proved to be rather strong and robust and were able to resist some of the terror attacks and revolutionary movements that were established there. Part of this, they believed, was due to, again, the Qutb belief that the Western cultural decadence had warped and corrupted the minds of Middle Eastern Muslims. And so the tactics had to switch to sort of shake them out of their Western stupor. So in order to accomplish this, they decided that they had to attack the source of the decadence itself, which was the United States and the West. And thus the focus moved from the near enemy, which were these pro-Western dictators in the Middle East, to the far enemy, which was the United States itself. And they were able to switch tactics in part because globalization made it easier for isolated, lightly armed groups to travel to the United States to take advantage of globalized media to make their attacks news around the world. And this is something they couldn't do prior to the 1990s. There were many who adopted this far enemy strategy even before Al-Qaeda as we know today were fully constituted. Individuals under the leadership of Ramzi Yousef actually attacked the World Trade Center in 1993. People forget about that now because of obviously what happened later. But the strategy began fairly early on, even in the early 90s. Al-Qaeda as we know it today comes into its own in the later 90s with the Luxor attack in Egypt in 1997, where a bunch of Al-Qaeda gunmen attacked and killed approximately 70 tourists at the Luxor Pyramid. After that, we have the embassy bombings in Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, which killed several hundred people between the two attacks there. You have attacks against American military infrastructure in 2000. In this case, in one particular case, the attack on the U.S. Navy frigate, the USS Cole in Yemen. And then, of course, most famously, the attack of September 11th, which destroyed the World Trade Center and badly damaged the Pentagon. So 9/11 represents an important step, not because it was the arrival of Salafist-style terrorism, as we've already seen, that already existed and had been present in the world for some time. What 9/11 represented was an expansion of terrorist capabilities and the ability of terrorists to operate globally. And this capability arrives not because they developed technology or they developed their own means of transport. The capability is a function of globalization. It is what the French would call détournement. This term literally translates into English as hijacking, although we don't mean merely hijacking an airplane, but hijacking the globalization itself, turning the power of the empire, so to speak, back on itself. And notice the more power the capabilities of the empire, the more effective and damaging the terrorist attacks are. So think about 9/11 and the impact of 9/11. One of the things that made this so impactful was the fact that the media, the pictures, and the images of that attack were being beamed around the world constantly, over and over and over again. If this attack takes place in a pre-globalized media world, then maybe the attacks aren't as powerful because that imagery isn't created and isn't disseminated. But because of globalization, because of global media, because of satellite communications, because of 24-hour news, the ability of the terrorists to seem more powerful than they actually are is greatly enhanced because of these media capabilities. Also think about in terms of transportation. The ability for the terrorists to destroy a building doesn't come from their ability to develop their own unique weapons or build their own missiles, but by hijacking airliners, a technology that doesn't belong to them. And suddenly every airliner is potentially a terrorist target and necessitates the whole security apparatus that exists now. One of the Al-Qaeda subsidiaries that gets a lot of attention these days, in part because they're engaged in an active civil conflict in the country of Yemen, is AQAP, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The most famous individual associated with AQAP is actually a CSU grad. Anwar al-Awlaki is an American citizen, got his master's degree in mechanical engineering, I believe, at Colorado State, but eventually became persuaded of the Salafist ideology and relocated to the Middle East, relocated to Yemen, and joined and became part of the AQAP cell. Because of his active participation in AQAP, most specifically his use of media, because he was an American citizen, spoke English fluently, he made lots of videos, YouTube videos, that were both celebrations of AQAP's successful attacks and also served to recruit new members of AQAP. So because of this, the United States targeted him with a drone strike in 2013 that killed him. And this is controversial because, like I said, he was an American citizen and he was killed by the United States without a trial, without any kind of accusation or formal charges brought against him. He was simply labeled an enemy combatant and was dispatched by a drone. But AQAP, despite this loss, continues today, and as I already mentioned, is very active in the country of Yemen, which is on the southwestern edge of the Arabian Peninsula. Even today, like I said, there's a civil conflict going on there, a civil war, in which the United States is actually boosting Saudi Arabian intervention there. And if you're paying attention to it, it's a rather sad situation with a potential mass death taking place due to tainted water supplies and the collapse of civilian infrastructure there. Another smaller Al-Qaeda affiliate is AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. You can see here this is an area that's largely encompasses the Sahara Desert, or what's called the Sahel. It's the northern tier of Africa, and has been fairly active, although on much smaller scale. Their most noticeable attack, or most familiar attack, has been the attack on the Radisson Hotel in 2015 in the country of Mali. And one of the places they find shelter is in the northern regions of Mali and Niger. And you probably have heard about in recent days and weeks the death of 4 Special Forces soldiers, American Special Forces soldiers in Niger. And this is what they were going after, this group, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. You don't see a lot of attention these days given to it because, again, they're a smaller group. But because the global war on terror is against all terrorist groups that are animated by Salafism, the U.S. has a significance, not a huge, but a significant presence in Northern Africa right now. A lot of it unknown to most people because they're trying to keep it quiet in order to surprise the terrorists that are operating there, both AQIM and Boko Haram, who we'll talk about here in a moment. And finally, we get to ISIS, or as I think formerly the U.S. government name for them is ISIL. Academically, you also hear them just referred to as IS, or the Islamic State. And in other parts of the world, they'll be referred to as Daesh, but they don't like that name, so, don't call them that, they get upset. ISIS is not the threat and not the presence it once was. They've lost a lot of ground. Made their control of their 2 major capitals, Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria. But they still are fairly active and control a substantial amount of territory in eastern Syria and northern Iraq. They emerged as a result of the vacuum that was created both by the weakening of the Assad regime, the government's inability to exercise sovereignty over eastern Syria, and the weak Iraqi state that sort of revealed itself when the United States left Iraq for good in 2014. The success of ISIS saw many other Salafist groups around the world emulate its example and certainly emulate its iconography with that sort of signature black and white flag that you see in all these slides displayed quite prominently. Boko Haram, as I sort of mentioned, is also very active in the Sahel of Africa. It affiliates itself with ISIS, although it's not part of the original ISIS group in the Levant. It's actually a much more brutal and gruesome and horrendous group than ISIS is. For the reputation ISIS has for killing, Boko Haram actually has them beat. It's obviously it doesn't have the same media out capabilities that ISIS does, but it's killed more people than ISIS has. It's engaged in mass killing and mass rape on a much broader and widespread level in Africa than even ISIS has. You might remember a few years ago the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. And what was that all about? Well, it was Boko Haram taking control of several villages and scooping up all the young girls there and turning them into sex slaves for the men of the group, and ultimately, in some cases, killing them if they didn't perform their duties in the appropriate way. And you might wonder if those girls that were ever brought back, and the answer is in large extent no. Those girls were taken by Boko Haram, and we don't know really what happened to them. Some of them did manage to make their way back to their home villages, but a lot of them, we never knew what happened to them. We have to assume that a lot of them are killed, and a lot of them are still under the under the control of Boko Haram. Further east, in the Horn of Africa, you have Al-Shabaab. This is a militia that's, again, affiliated with ISIS, but not part of ISIS. They're most active in Somalia and parts of northern Kenya. Their most famous attack is the Westgate Mall attack in 2013 in Nairobi, Kenya, where they took over a mall and killed several shoppers. And also a large group of them managed to escape that attack. They weren't killed in the counter-terrorist attack that took place to root them out. They managed to escape, well, in large part with other hostages in that particular attack. Al-Shabaab is notorious for using food as a leverage for power. The Horn of Africa is prone to drought, it's prone to famine, and food aid that's intercepted by Al-Shabaab is oftentimes used as a way for them to gain access to power in that region. They won't allow food to arrive at a village unless the village elders declare their support for Al-Shabaab and turn over their young men to be fighters and their young women to be, comfort women. So Al-Shabaab remains a powerful force in this particular part of Africa. And as a result, the United States has a military presence here, largely located in the small state of Djibouti, where there is, among other things, a drone base. And these drones fly out every day looking for Al-Shabaab targets to attack. I should pause here a moment and talk about suicide terrorism, because there's a tendency to associate suicide terrorism with Salafist terrorism. And clearly there is a lot of suicide-oriented terrorism that takes place with these Salafist groups, most especially with the 9/11 attacks. But suicide terrorism is not unique to them. Suicide terrorism is something we see a lot of in a lot of different groups around the world. The political science Robert Pape did a very interesting study where he sort of compiled all the suicide terror attacks that took place, and concluded that most of them are not done by Islamist figures, and they're not even religious in their orientation. The vast majority of suicide attacks were committed by secular nationalists fighting for national liberation, or what they saw as national liberation. Suicide attacks are popular not because of the promise of the reward in the afterlife, although in some cases that is a motivation for suicide terrorism. In large part, suicide terrorism is a tactic selected because it's effective, because to get around certain countermeasures, to protect vital targets or sensitive targets, the best way of getting around those countermeasures is having a human being negotiate those countermeasures with a bomb strapped to them, and access a sensitive area with lots of people, lots of important people, and set off that bomb. And that's why suicide terrorism exists. It's not, as it's often portrayed, as uniquely an Islamic terrorist phenomenon. So I'm going to conclude this module by discussing how to stop terrorism. And I mean terrorism in this case, not just Salafist terrorism, but terrorism broadly understood. So can we stop terrorism? Should we stop terrorism? Um, is it something we should just accept as part of the background of modern life? Is terrorism, in fact, really the threat it's made out to be? If we do want to stop terrorism, what are the ways of countering it? And what are the ways to neutralize its sources? It turns out that there's a very strong argument to be made that terrorism isn't a threat and we shouldn't do anything. Not only because terrorism in the grand scheme of things isn't the threat it's made out to be, but because one of the best ways to neutralize the ideology of terrorism, one of the best ways to persuade those who were tempted to engage in terrorism is to show that it doesn't work. And one of the best ways of showing that it doesn't work is for nothing to change after a terrorist attack, for everyone to go about their daily life, not to make wholesale changes in the government, because making wholesale changes is a signal to the terrorists that you had an impact. Your actions have altered the government and the decision making of those who you're trying to persuade to change or trying to destroy. Israel actually does this pretty well. During the first Intifada, which was the first Palestinian uprising, one of the preferred ways the Palestinians, the Hamas especially, attacked Israeli targets was to detonate suicide bombers on buses in Jerusalem. And the reaction of the Israeli population was basically, after one of these buses was destroyed, to get back on the bus and continue as if nothing ever happened. And what happened was very interesting is Hamas just said that, this blowing up buses is really making us look bad. We're killing a lot of civilians when we blow up these, buses. And we're not having any real impact. We're just making the Israelis more angry, making the world more angry at us. It's just stealing their resolve to destroy us and to fight back. So maybe we need to pursue some other strategy here. But still, it'll still be violent. We still want to destroy Israel. But blowing up buses filled with civilians may not be the best way of realizing our goals. And when you look at all the things that could possibly kill you, all the things that would lead to a premature death, terrorism is way down on the list. As this chart shows, most of us if we're going to die a premature death, it's going to be due to heart disease. Or we're going to fall off a ladder, or we're going to slip in the shower. We're 100 times more likely to be killed by a police officer than we are in the West to be killed by a terror attack. We're more likely to be struck by lightning. We're more likely to be killed by a swarm of bees. I mean, the list goes on. So there's a question that's asked often. Given the billions and perhaps even trillions of dollars that have been spent, and again, if you look at the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan as a reaction to and steps to confront terrorism, we have spent, the United States in this case, has spent literally trillions of dollars trying to root this problem out. And yet, if you look at the actual lethality of the problem, how many people does it kill? It's way down on the list of things that could potentially kill you. So it raises the question, how should we approach dealing with terrorism, given that terrorism is not the threat that it's made out to be? It's very difficult to argue this. However, no politician's going to say, I think terrorism is an overblown threat and not that big a deal, so let's not worry about it. In many ways, this is an untenable position. A state's obligated to protect its people, so things must be done to stop terrorism. So if that's going to be the course of action, then what's available? Let's look at legal measures first. Oftentimes, we see temporary laws or emergency laws passed to deal with terror problems. And these emergency laws more often than not will suspend civil liberties or rearrange civil liberties in order to address security problems. We see this with the USA Patriot Act after 2001. This act made it legal for the government to retrieve data and conduct surveillance that had been considered violations of civil liberties prior to that point. In the UK, after the attacks there, especially after 2005, the tube and bus attacks there, you saw terrorism acts passed that are very, very invasive, that give the government a lot of power to collect data and conduct surveillance against both citizens and foreigners who are visiting. It's very easy now for the police there to search a bag of someone on the street, whereas before you had to get some kind of permission or a warrant. And today, if the UK government declares some kind of emergency or a special situation, you can be randomly searched on the streets of London in the UK. Other measures the state can take with regards to terrorism: they can alter their police forces to form paramilitary interdiction capabilities. This is sort of what we see with police embracing SWAT tactics more often. We see police more likely dressed in what would be described as military gear, brandishing military style weapons. And this is a more common sight in the Western world now, especially in bigger cities and sensitive targets. You are likely to see police dressed as soldiers as a means of deterring terrorism or having ready-to-go capability in case a terrorist attack takes place. From a more military point of view, we see more preemptive strikes. These can be airstrikes. These can be special operations. These can be drone strikes. Any number of military options that would, again, in the past be questionable and problematic, but today are conducted without so much as a second thought. Also very controversial are the notions of the tactics of torture and rendition. We all know what torture is. The U.S. has engaged in torture at some of its overseas sites in the past. And also rendition is very controversial. This is the practice of going to a foreign country and literally kidnapping a suspect off the street without the permission of the state you are operating in. The United States did this on several occasions after 9/11 in Italy, where certain people suspected of being terrorists or being sympathetic with terrorists were kidnapped off the streets of, in this case, Milan, without the Italian government even knowing about it. And this upset them. This upset the Italians a great deal because states don't like it when foreigners come in and circumvent their rule of law without permission. And finally, you have perhaps the most drastic forms of anti-terror activity: intervention, invading a state in order to deal with the terrorist threat. Many people have argued that this was the ultimate justification for the invasion of both Afghanistan and Iraq, to deal with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups that existed there. I want to quickly go through some international measures that exist. These are primarily treaties and protocols that the UN has passed that deal with terrorist attacks. There's 5 formal conventions that deal with terrorism. As you can see, there are 3 are listed here and then 2 on the other slide. First one deals with prevention and punishing crimes against heads of state and diplomatic agents, basically saying it's wrong to assassinate politicians, heads of state, presidents, prime ministers, and their various diplomatic agents. In 1979, you have the International Convention Against Taking of Hostages. In 1997, the Convention on the Suppression of Bombings, saying, terrorist bombings for political purposes is against international law. In 1999, recognizing that much terrorism relies on international money raising, international finance. The UN passed the Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism. And in 2005, there was the Convention on the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, basically facilitating cooperation among states to suppress the trafficking and movement of materials that could be used for the making of a nuclear bomb. Beyond the UN protocols, we also have NATO getting involved. NATO implemented Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which is the most famous of the articles that says that an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all. After 9/11, basically saying that the attack against the United States was an attack against all NATO countries. And that gave NATO the green light to participate in the war in Afghanistan, which has been a NATO operation, with many NATO countries, key NATO countries, sending troops there and engaging in the conflict zone, including Germany, France, Great Britain, Italy. All the major NATO countries have had soldiers there participating in that conflict in some way. One of the problems with dealing with terrorism in this day and age is that terrorism is particularly good at taking advantage of the vulnerabilities of democracy, in part because democracy features the protection of certain civil liberties, and those civil liberties are where the terrorists can have the ability to have the biggest impact. And so the question becomes, can democracy, as it's currently understood, defeat terrorism and still be a democracy? In other words, if you have to suspend all your civil liberties in order to defeat the terrorist threat, you're no longer a democracy, you're something else. You're an authoritarian state, you're an autocracy, you're something else. Is that the price that has to be paid in order to defeat terrorism? Is it necessary to suspend these civil liberties for a period of time to destroy the terrorists and then go back to restoring those civil liberties? Of course, the question becomes, if you remove civil liberties, do you ever really get them back? This brings up perhaps the most central question with regards to suppressing terrorism, especially as it pertains to things like surveillance. We know with the revelations of Edward Snowden that the U.S. has the ability basically to surveil every human being in the United States and probably on planet Earth who's connected to some kind of communication device. Is this the price that must be paid to deal with groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and whoever may pop up in the future? Can human rights and security against terrorist-style attacks coexist in a world of globalization? And if the answer is no, they can't, that certain civil liberties and human rights have to be abandoned or surrendered in order to make the world safe, does this mean the terrorists win? Because ultimately, the terrorists are, if you go back to what we talked about in the last module, the terrorists are about bringing out the most extreme exercises of power by the state in order to delegitimize the state. And if you have mass surveillance, if you have military and police actions that sort of make the world a battlefield, isn't that the kind of thing the terrorists are trying to bring about? A state that has overstepped its boundaries, that's no longer interested in protecting people and citizens, but in protecting its own power. If that happens, do the terrorists win and democracy and freedom lose? It's difficult. It's a difficult question to answer. Perhaps one way to answer this question is to look at past terror campaigns and see how they ended. And if these terrorist groups were effectively destroyed, or was the campaign brought to end some other way? First thing we have to realize is that no terror groups win out in a total victory. That's almost never happens. Terror campaigns end when the terrorists enter politics, enter some kind of legitimate form of political engagement. Not because they get everything they want, but because they realize that the terrorist tactics are not going to bring them everything they want. So, in large part, successfully entering a terror campaign means persuading those groups that they've got more to gain by abandoning the tactics of terrorism than by continuing to pursue them. This is true also for those who are trying to destroy terrorism. A fully militarized war against terrorism almost never brings complete success. There are always costs and consequences to trying to eradicate a terrorist group by trying to kill every member of that group. That almost never works. What we see looking at the history of terrorism is that success comes by some kind of middle ground, some kind of settlement. Sometimes by the hated notion of negotiating with terrorists. This might not be possible with every group. It's difficult to see how you negotiate with a group like ISIS. But in other cases, the solution comes from trying to find the beginning of some kind of common ground. And if this isn't possible with ISIS, it may be possible with a group like the Taliban in Afghanistan. And I'll conclude by showing you this very ugly chart that shows that, generally speaking, the best path to ending terrorism is through politics, by negotiating with terrorists and bringing them to the negotiating table. There is something to be said for military tactics and policing tactics. They aren't completely ineffective, but politics is the biggest chunk of this chart, and it suggests that for most cases, if you want to end terrorism, it's done at the table, not in the battlefield.